is Ashley Mark. And so for those of you who watch the virtual commencement on Saturday, you'll be able to see Ashley present there as well as our program in the environment student speaker. And so we're very excited to see her speech then, but for now we will listen to her thesis presentation. And so her thesis is Helping David Defeat Goliath, Coalition Building to Achieve Procedural Justice in Utility Integrated Resource Planning. And so her thesis advisor is also Tony Reams in the School for Environment and Sustainability, and her thesis reader is Noah Hall in Program Within the Environment. So we'll let you share your screen, Ashley, and share your work.
All right, give me 1 second. Is that doing the thing? Perfect. All right, so thank you all for tuning in. It's awesome that we have this opportunity to present even though we're not on campus. So thanks to Jamie and Jason and Shelly for making it happen. I'm super excited to share my research with you all. As Shelly mentioned, my thesis is titled Helping David Defeat Goliath, Coalition Building to Achieve Procedural Justice in Utility Integrated Resource Planning. So I thought I'd begin with just a brief kind of overview to help frame the presentation. There we go. So since Public Act 341 was enacted in 2016, Michigan utilities are required to facilitate public participation while designing the utilities' 15-year plan, which is called an integrated resource plan, but I'll be referring to it as an IRP. A Michigan Utilities IRP must be approved by the Michigan Public Service Commission, or the MPSC. DTE Energy, a utility that serves 12 counties in southeastern Michigan, inadequately fulfilled the requirements of Public Act 341, excluding the public from the IRP planning process. And this prompted justice advocates within the Work For Me DTE Coalition to themselves facilitate meaningful public education and engagement, ultimately in the pursuit of procedural justice. So the objective of my research was to identify what steps the Work For Me DTE Coalition took and what the outcomes of their efforts looked like for each party involved. So to jump right into some background information, the environmental justice movement formally began in 1982 when residents of Warren County, North Carolina protested unjust dumping of PCB-laced soil in the city of Afton. And the Warren County case set off what we refer to now as a movement for distributive justice, which has to do with who gets what. Many failures in distributive justice arise due to a lack of procedural justice, which is concerned more so with the fairness of the decision-making processes that determine the distribution of environmental rights and wrongs. The major way of achieving procedural justice is through some form of direct public participation. In terms of the energy sector, utilities have very little, if any, incentive to actively seek out public comment. And the typical approach to decision-making is this decide, announce, defend strategy. And this model places public input downstream of decision-making. So the decisions have technically been made before the public is really offered an opportunity to engage. One safeguard for utility customers is a state's integrated resource planning requirement. So integrated resource planning began in the late 80s, and as of 2015, 33 US states require that each of their utilities provide an IRP every 5 years. An IRP is designed by the utility and lays out future long-term goals and plans for both energy production and distribution. And in some states, as part of this IRP process, utilities are required to provide opportunities for public participation. In Michigan, the body that's responsible for governing utilities is the Michigan Public Service Commission, or the MPSC. One major policy by the MPSC that has created an opening for procedural justice is Public Act 341 of the 2016 Michigan Energy Law. And through this public act, the MPSC creates parameters and filing requirements for IRPs. And there's also this public outreach component. So in short, these requirements encourage utilities to allow for public participation and comments throughout the development of their IRP. and also recommends at least 2 public meetings be held at convenient times and locations in order to gather this public input. As is apparent in the language of these requirements, they are really loose suggestions, and ultimately the utilities have the freedom to decide how they interpret and fulfill these guidelines. So the goal of my research was 1, to outline and analyze the process used by the Work For Me DTE Coalition, and 2, to assess the efficacy of this process in terms of achieving procedural justice within this specific DTE IRP case. So I identified 4 components of the coalition's process that really serve as a roadmap for their involvement in the case. And these are identifying energy injustice, education, engagement, and ultimately the outcome. As for the methods, in order to inform my research, I interviewed several members of the coalition that were directly involved in the case. And this included justice advocates, lawyers, and other professionals. And I conducted a total of 9 interviews from which I drew out quotes in order to make up the body of my thesis paper and provide evidence for the claims that I make throughout that paper. So to jump right in, before steps could be taken by the coalition to encourage and facilitate public participation, first there had to be this moment of recognition that some outside push was really necessary. So in terms of injustices and utilities, they operate under an investor-owned utility model. And this really places private interest in front of public interest and makes the main incentive for decision-making increasing or maximizing profits for investors. And DTE Energy has been especially hard hit with criticism from the public even before this IRP cycle. And as Michelle Martinez of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition points out in this quote, customers have shown dissatisfaction with DTE's high rates, the frequency of shutoffs, and also their strategies to implement renewable forms of energy. In terms of injustices facing the public is often excluded from utility or energy related discussions because of their technocratic and technical nature, and because of this public reputation of know nothingness, as it's been referred to. While it is true that few individuals have the background to really speak intelligently on the technical details involved with planning, they still have the ability to voice their concerns in other areas, like those pointed out by Alexis Blitzman. And these are things like rates or dissatisfaction with pollutants being released from energy production. For low-income residents, decisions made by their utility will impact their lives even more significantly due to their high energy burden or this high proportion of their income being spent on electricity. So they have the right to provide meaningful input that is heard by the utility. The Michigan Public Service Commission's role is really to represent the public in terms of utility decision making. And while DTE has received substantial backlash for the energy related decisions they've made, it has to be noted that DTE was acting within the rules and guidelines set for them by the MPSC. And so therefore the question really turns to whether or not the commission is truly representing the public to the best of their ability. One example of this is the Blue Water Energy Center. In 2018, the MPSC approved DTE's proposal for this $1 billion natural gas power plant. And despite lots of backlash from environmental groups, the MPSC refused to reconsider this, and so it is set to open in 2022. So the Work For Me DTE Coalition formed as a response to the injustices I laid out. It was led by the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition and Solidarity, and their goal was to influence the MPSC decision regarding DTE's IRP approval, so whether it would be approved or not. Before contributions could really be made by the community members, an initial step was to become educated about these very technical issues at hand. So the first pillar of necessary education really regards the process. What is the MPSC? A lot of people in Michigan don't even know that there is a utility, or there is a body that regulates the utility decisions. And the next pillar of education really concerned the IRP itself. So what is an IRP? What are the implications of this plan? And as Michelle Martinez points out, the technocratic language of a document like an IRP really requires translation work in order for someone who isn't a lawyer or an engineer to be able to engage. So according to Public Act 341, utilities, including DTE, are required to educate potential participants on utility plans. So DTE responded to this requirement with educational opportunities that seemed to fulfill the requirement, but did not really provide adequate opportunities for education that would lead to the public's ability to engage in the case. And most of those interviewed agreed with the views of Mark Templeton, who was the lead counsel for Solidarity, that the materials did not directly address the IRP and that they did not present information in a way that prompted engagement in any way. So again, the coalition stepped up. In order to carry out this translation work on their own, they first reached out to their own membership bases and then expanded beyond there to share information with other groups. And one really cool way that they tried to educate the public was through the IRP report card, which was an effort led by Vote Solar. And basically what they did was break up DTE's IRP into these different categories you can see in this image, and then they assigned a letter grade to each of the categories. So this created a much more thorough and comprehensible way for the public to become educated in the IRP. After educational opportunities were sorted out, the next step was to get the public actively involved. So many opportunities for engagement were offered through chances to submit public comment either online or at open houses. There were lots of issues with the open houses, as Jackson Coppell notes here. They were sort of this dog and pony show where DTE was trying to show off. And there were also a lot of problems logistically. There was no childcare, either poor or no translation services. They were all held in Wayne, all three were held in Wayne County, despite the fact that DTE's service area extends across 12 Michigan counties. And it was also unclear how and to what extent comment cards collected at these meetings would actually contribute to the decision-making process. So again, Work For Me DTE stepped up. They encouraged the MPSC to themselves hold a hearing in Detroit where interested DTE customers could come in and speak directly to the commissioners, knowing that they were being heard. And the coalition also provided other support for public engagement, but the greatest contribution was their formal testimony. The groups within the coalition really allowed especially low-income and minority voices to be elevated, providing a better platform through which the MPSC could really hear and acknowledge these voices. The outcome looks a little different depending on what group you're focused on. For DTE Energy, ultimately, they fulfilled the public outreach requirement of Public Act 341, but there is no evidence of meaningful incorporation of this public input. The Michigan Public Service Commission declared DTE's public outreach efforts to be sufficient, but they agreed with the Work For Me DTE coalition that the IRP itself was not sufficient. And so they actually ended up sending DTE back to the drawing board to revise and restructure this plan. As Charlotte Jameson points out, while there was public input, it was really this expert testimony from the coalition members that most heavily influenced the MPSC decision on behalf of the public. The representatives of the coalition were quite satisfied with the outcome, and they really expressed gratitude towards the Public Service Commission for choosing to make such a bold and potentially unpopular statement by rejecting DTE's plan. One of the main suggestions that came out of this was that the MPSC should require engagement much earlier and much more often, since this type of process would allow citizens to stay up to date with the information instead of having to learn it all at the same time that they're being asked to contribute to the conversation. So in the end, procedural justice was achieved, but not necessarily how they may or we may have expected. Rather than direct public comment making the difference, the main source of justice came from the coalition's efforts to provide a platform and elevate the voices of the public through input and testimony. Regardless of the source of influence, ultimately the outcome came out in favor of the public, And this sense of recognition and being heard will likely encourage members of the public to be more active in future decisions. The IRP process also uncovered a need for stricter MPSC guidelines. If the utilities aren't going to ensure satisfactory opportunities for education and engagement, then the MPSC, who is responsible for representing the public, really needs to do this themselves. So while success seems to have fallen on the side of the coalitions, the ball is now in DTE's court. So they have an opportunity to revise their proposal, or they cannot do that and therefore forfeit the benefits that would come with an MPSC approved IRP. So a huge thank you to Tony, Noah, Jamie, and Jason, and also all of the people who allowed me to interview them from Work For Me DTE. I'll take any questions.
Right, thanks so much, Ashley. So again, if you have questions for Ashley, you can type them into the chat box, or if you would like, you can unmute your microphone now and ask her directly.
Hi, this is Steve Bertman.
Oh my gosh.
I'd love to ask Ashley a question.
Please, Steve. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so given that most of your work was focused on the methodology of Work For Me, do you feel like there was anything sort of novel or groundbreaking in their methods that can be applied to future cases, or do you think that this is sort of already pretty standard and effective procedure?
Yeah, I think it was really the coalition structure of their kind of organization that allowed them to really have a meaningful impact. It was like many different organizations who specialized in different things. You had like the Sierra Club, but also these justice-based organizations who are all sharing resources and really working collectively to reach out to their membership bases and get the attention of anyone they could. So I really think the coalition like methodology has already been, there's been a lot of research on that and just like the success that comes out of that. But I think that's kind of what makes this unique. But yeah, as for specifically this coalition having anything special, I think really is just the collective effort of all of them together representing people.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming, Steve. Additional questions? So Ashley, I'll just have one fairly quick one for you, which is the idea of utilities trying to be good community citizens. And I think you showed some good examples of how DTE was not effective in soliciting public participation and pointed out some of the flaws in their approach. If you could design a process that really would be effective to get sort of the public comment and the public participation in there in a more effective way, what would future utilities take from this as far as being better community citizens?
Yeah, I think that's something I asked everybody I interviewed, actually, was just like, if you could restructure this, what would it look like? And the consensus was just that this process wasn't isolated to the year that they're working on the IRP, that this process of engagement and really educating and communicating with the public and not shutting them out of what's going on, that like engagement takes place all the time. And it's like this very long-term iterative process that allows people to know what's going on. And then when a big decision like the IRP comes along, they already have that understanding to be able to make a contribution to the discussion in like a meaningful way.
Any final quick questions?
I had a quick question, Ashley, about the makeup of the MPSC. And I'm guessing that that's maybe a collection of some industry representatives along with some community members. And I'm wondering if you had any insight about how the composition of that affected some of these issues that you delved into.
Definitely. So there are 3 commissioners who have individual like groups that are specialized in different areas that they communicate with. But recently, I think it might have been in 2016, just after this new Michigan energy law was passed, 2 of the commissioners, I believe, got replaced. And they've found that these newer commissioners are much more invested in public outreach and like public engagement and trying and like focus on climate change issues. And so they have seen like improvement. Just the fact that the MPSC held their own meeting for the public to come to was very like telling that they care and they're like open to public input. So yeah, it's made up of these 3 members, but I would say that it's like very important who those 3 people are to how the outcome's going to look like, or what the outcome's going to look like.
Great. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions, but thank you, Ashley, for sharing your work, and we celebrate your accomplishments in completing this. So congratulations.